All right, so there are people still drifting in, but I think I'll get started anyway. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. I guess it's around afternoon in most parts of the world where all the attendees are from, because this webinar was targeted for the APAC time zones. The webinar is server-side tagging in Google Tag Manager. This webinar was a completely ad hoc decision to organize because last week when server-side tagging was released to Google Tag Manager, it obviously raised a lot of question and quite a bit of confusion around the topic as well, because it's such a kind of brand new topic and in a way a completely new paradigm for how to do tagging with the Google stack. So I thought that this webinar would be a great way to just persuade people to take a look at the feature as what it is and try to get rid of these misconceptions around what this feature is, and trying to focus on the facts, because there's a lot of things when it comes to server-side analytics and server-side tagging and server-side tracking. There's a lot of polarizing opinions about is this the correct direction to go to when talking about things like user privacy and data security, and also the quality of data collection. So this webinar is I would say it's geared towards the intermediate GTM user. There's going to be a few technical things here as well. It's not going to be completely how to use Google Tag Manager, nothing like that. I'm expecting some knowledge about how GTM works, but even if you're a complete novice to GTM, then maybe just take this as an introduction to server-side tagging in general. Google Tag Manager isn't the first tool to do that. There are plenty of other tag management solutions with server-side capabilities like Segment or Telium or other tools in that space. But Google, being Google, obviously makes waves whenever they do anything. So one of the purposes of this webinar is to help understand this concept from a Google point of view. I'm going to introduce the agenda and myself briefly in just a bit, just a simple housekeeping thing. So if you feel free to use the chat as much as you like. I probably won't interact with the chat that much, simply because it's just me doing this webinar, and there are quite a few of you, so it would kind of divert my attention away from the topic itself. But feel free to discuss in the chat with other attendees, and once this webinar is over, I'll go over the chat log, and if there's something interesting that I missed, I might come back to it in Twitter or LinkedIn, or maybe in a blog post even. Just remember to, if you want to chat with the other attendees, make sure to check from the drop down in the chat window to switch from all panelists to all panelists and attendees. So that way the other attendees can see your message. There's the Q&A feature. If you hover over the lower part of the Zoom window, there's the Q&A feature, which I hope you will use. You can add questions to the Q&A, and so you can add questions to the, hold on, JV just wrote, looks like the audio isn't working. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so JV, maybe it's in your I'll just type it here. JV, maybe it's your speakers. Looks like everyone else can hear me. So please add questions to the Q&A. There's an upvote feature. So you can upvote certain questions that you want me to get to first. And feel free to ask whatever you feel like is worth asking. It doesn't have to have anything to do with server-side tagging. It can be more questions about the gear. I'll let the upvote feature then kind of prioritize the list for me. There will be a recording of this webinar, which I'll post on my YouTube channel. I haven't yet decided how to curate the videos, because there's going to be 3 similar webinars, one for each time zone group. So I might do like a supercut with all the best parts of each webinar, or then I'll just put the webinars as they are in YouTube. I haven't decided yet. It depends on how much time I have on my hands. So I think that's it for the practical stuff. Keep those questions coming in, and just enjoy the show. And if there's anything like important comes up, I have no idea how I'll react to that. If sound drops out or video drops out, maybe the easiest way to contact me is by tweeting to me, because I probably be on a full screen sharing mode rather than watching the chat. But let's hope everything goes fine. It's just me here, and this is the first time I'm doing a Zoom webinar, so please bear with me and accept any flaws as a charming attribute of this presentation. So I'm going to share my screen now, and after I share my screen, I'm going to jump quickly back to the Zoom window to make sure that you guys are seeing what you should be seeing. So right now I have shared my screen, and you should be seeing a keynote window. So if somebody could just confirm this, maybe that you're seeing. Okay, cool. Yeah. So server-side tagging in Google Tag Manager was released to a public beta last week by Google. Public beta means that it's feature ready. It's ready for production deployment. I've got it running on a number of production sites right now, with the caveat that it's not feature complete yet. So it's going to be, new features are going to be introduced. There's no SLA there yet. There's no division to enterprise and free features. It's like a finished package, but it's waiting for community feedback before actually being released into the wild as a non-beta product. But because it's a public beta, everybody can access it. Anybody with a GTM account can create a new server container. This webinar is my platinum, gold, diamond only sponsor is Data Driven. Data Driven is run by my good friend Jeff Sauer. Many people know Jeff as one of the most prolific trainers in the Google stack and in marketing tools, and how to build your own online digital agency, how to curate your own courses. So take a look at Data Driven and their course offering. There's so much for everybody, and I periodically do webinars there as well. So you'll get to see more of me if that's what you want. I'm not sure why you would want that. And I'd be remiss to mention my own blog. So many of the things I'm covering here today are already covered in the blog itself. And there's a couple of video links from those blog posts as well. So take a look at the blog if this subject matter interests you. And there's going to be plenty more server-side tagging articles coming up in the future. And you can find me on, the best way to interact with me is on Twitter at Simo Ahaba. But I'm also under LinkedIn under my own name, so you can follow me there as well if you're interested. So the agenda for today, we're going to start with a quick introduction to server-side tagging. It's going to be quick because there's so much material about server-side tagging out there already, and I don't want to just rehash the same old. I want to jump to key benefits and concerns as well, because this is one of those areas that's going to be polarizing a lot of opinions. So there's lots of great stuff that server-side tagging enables, but there's also the downside that it's a platform that anybody can exploit and abuse because it's a blank slate essentially. So we'll take a look at some of those concerns as well. Then I'll jump to a walkthrough. So I'll enter the browser and take the biggest risk there is in live presentation, which is doing a code walkthrough. So I'll walk through the motions of taking a Google Analytics and Atlas Web setup on the web and transporting that to the server-side layer. And finally, we'll leave time for the Q&A. Time-wise, I might have mentioned this in one of those introductory emails. I had no idea how long this will take. I've mentally prepared for a full 90 minutes, but I don't mind going over. And if we run out of things to talk about, I don't mind going under. I don't want to keep you out of your afternoons and out of your mornings and out of your daily duties any longer than necessary. But if those good questions keep on coming, and if there's lots to talk about, then we'll just keep going until my next meeting, which is in a couple of hours. So if that's fine with everybody, let's get going. I'll just quickly one last time check the chat window because there's some. Okay, cool. We are good to go. But now I'll just quickly need to dismiss the chat. Here we go. So starting with the introduction, and this is going to be the elevator pitch for server-side tagging. Server-side tagging essentially is a server, a web server that you own and have full control of. So the difference between client-side and server-side in this particular scenario is that client-side tagging refers to typically a web browser or a device where you're directly interacting with the device user or the browser user with your code. So a client-side Facebook pixel, for example, would be a pixel that fires in the browser and sends the data directly to Facebook from the browser itself. So it's the browser communicating with the vendor directly. When we talk about a server-side endpoint, you are essentially discussing something to which you send the data first before shipping it to Facebook. So the Facebook pixel, instead of sending it directly to Facebook, would now send it to your server environment, your own server. And within that server, you can do whatever you want with that hit. You can discard it, you can update it, you can purge it from sensitive information, and then you can send it to Facebook. So we're talking about typically we use the word proxy here. So we're talking about a proxy environment, which acts as a new milestone between the browser or the device and the vendor itself. So the term that I like to use, which was introduced by a Googler, is a staging area. Instead of trusting vendors to collect the data correctly, you are actually processing all that data before it's being shipped to the vendors. And this obviously gives you a lot of control over what's being done with that data. You're no longer subservient to those third-party libraries doing their work correctly, or you don't have to be worried that they're collecting more than they should. You have a staging area where you can kind of analyze and validate the data pipeline before that information is shipped to the vendors. So this is what I mean when I say unprecedented control, and unprecedented in the Google stack. Again, I'm not saying that this is reinventing the wheel. I'm just saying that before in the Google stack, we haven't had tools like this. When we use Google Analytics, when we use Google Tag Manager, we are using services by Google, and the user in the browser is interacting directly with those services. And we have to trust that those services are doing their job correctly. We have to trust that they're not exploiting the user. And with MarTech and ad tech vendors, obviously that question of trust is very complicated, because we know that there's shady things going on with many vendors, doing things with our data that they maybe should not be doing, using third-party cookies for cross-site tracking. Well, with this kind of a staging area, you're potentially eliminating that risk, because you are, again, like I mentioned this word, this full control all the time. You're in full control of what happens to that data stream as it's shipped to the vendors. The other benefits of moving away from the browser or device is that you're reducing client-side bloat. So this is one of the biggest selling points of server-side tagging. You're reducing the need to add all those third-party libraries, all that complex JavaScript into the browser, where it takes a long time to load and process. And instead, you're delegating all that processing to the server itself. And because the server is running in a cloud environment or in your own on-premises environment, you're in charge of how much it scales. If you want to spend a couple of extra dollars every month, you can make sure that the latency is super, super thin, and those requests are processed really fast. So you can even create a fully functional informational API with the server side, not just a tagging proxy. You can avoid PII and cookie leaks. So cookie and credential leaks are one of the big problems of our industry, where third-party cookies, for example, are used for cross-site tracking, or where vendors are creating these kind of CNAME subdomain aliases and leeching all your credentials from your first-party cookies. Well, by controlling the downstream of data, again, you can make sure that only those cookies that are relevant are being used in the hits to the vendor databases. And same for PII. If you're collecting accidentally personally identifiable information or sending it in your refers, for example, it no longer goes to the vendor directly, but again, you can purge it in your server environment. Cross-site tracking, we already mentioned. And then there's also the idea that you can integrate it with other systems and APIs. So you have the full power of the server. And instead of subjecting the browser or the device to do all this crazy expensive computational work, the server itself can communicate with all these different APIs and enhance those hits or validate those hits before sending them forwards. One thing that I like to remind whenever working with GTM is that GTM is a blank slate, and this doesn't change with the server-side environment. In fact, it's even kind of more pronounced here. So by blank slate, I mean that it's just as destructive or constructive as those who use it. If you want to use server-side tagging for something unethical and something evil, if you want to build your own like cross-site tracking engine or your own crypto mining thing, or if you want to avoid ad blockers from kind of working correctly, you can do that. It's up to your own ethical standards and of course the legal frameworks that apply in your region. How compliant you want to be. I'm going to discuss this in the concerns part as well, so I'm not going to dwell here too much. But just remember that I'm definitely not promoting server-side GTM as a silver bullet to all an organization's woes. It's just as good or bad as the user who's using it. The way that the server-side tagging manifests in reality is that you have this new container type. So before we had these 4 different container types, and now we have a 5th one. We have a server container. And the beauty about this is that when you use server-side GTM, it's a very familiar interface. It's the exact same familiar Google Tag Manager that you're used to, with a couple of differences, which I'll mention soon. But you start the flow by creating the server container. Once you create the container itself, you have 2 options. You can automatically provision a tagging server, or you can manually provision one. So to provision a server means that you are delegating, or you are creating resources in a cloud environment, Google Cloud in this case, that are harnessed to run your server container. So server-side tagging runs currently only in Google Cloud Platform. That's the only deployment option right now. There are AWS is on the way, on-premises is on the way, and I'm sure that we'll have other cloud platforms on the way as well at some point. But right now, when you automatically provision a server, it creates an App Engine standard instance. So App Engine is a managed virtual machine running in Google Cloud. You don't have to, if this terminology is completely alien to you, don't worry about it. You don't have to know anything about it. It's a great thing if you want to take the time to learn about Google Cloud, because I think it's one of the coolest investments you can do in terms of knowledge and information. So automatically provisioning a server creates a single standard App Engine instance. It's not very powerful. It barely takes the load of even a modest site, but you can use it to test things around. It's completely free to use. You will need a credit card to get started with Cloud Platform in this case, but the App Engine standard instance very likely will not incur any costs. So you can kind of get your feet wet with the server-side container. Once you're ready for our production-ready deployment, you'll need to upgrade, and there are instructions for how to upgrade, how to manually provision extra servers by following these links. Another great thing that you can do is you can actually map the server endpoint to respond to your own domain. So until you do that, it will respond to a Google Cloud Platform domain, which is something.appspot.com. But you want to map your own custom subdomain as soon as possible, simply because that way you're creating a first-party context for those server-side endpoints. And first-party context is really important for ownership, because again, you will be in charge of that network traffic through your DNS. But also for things like being able to utilize first-party cookies when building your tracking schemas. So mapping a custom domain is one of the things you want to do as soon as possible, just so that your server-side endpoint can respond correctly. So in this case, I've mapped sgtm.cmojave.com for all interactions with my server-side endpoint. If you have multiple different top privately controlled domains that you all want to communicate with server-side tagging, you can add multiple domains or map multiple custom domains to a single App Engine setup. So you could add more than one domain here. There's some compatibility problems with server-side tagging on multiple domains. For example, preview mode will only work with a single domain, but I'm sure that they'll figure out a way to fix that at some point. When you jump to the production-ready deployment, so we're talking about 3 App Engine flexible instances here. That's what's recommended for a production-level deployment. Each flexible instance costs around $40 USD per month. So by upgrading to 3, assuming you don't have too much network egress, we're talking about 100 euros a month per minimum. So $120 a month per minimum. Once you start collecting those hits, and let's say you're collecting something like 100,000, 200,000 hits a day, maybe even more. I don't have any case studies around this currently or any statistics, but you will be paying a bit more. So every time App Engine needs to scale up to support the incoming traffic numbers, it's going to cost you a little bit more. And App Engine is charged by so-called instance hours. So as soon as that utilization drops, for example, during nighttime or weekends, you again pay a bit less. So I have one client who collects something like 10 to 50 million hits a day, and they are paying around 300 euros a month. But don't take that as gospel either. These things depend so much on the weight of those requests, and not just volume, but also quality and kind of size of those requests as well. And there are ways to mitigate this with sampling and other methods as well. But this is a solution that you need to pay for. The good thing is that there's no license cost, so you don't have to pay to Google to operate this. You can run it on your own. And once we get those on-premises options and other deployment options, you can freely kind of, twiggle things around to find the cheapest or the least expensive option for your particular needs. The following two diagrams are thankfully borrowed from Google themselves. They've done a great job explaining this. This is the situation before server-side tagging. So this is how Google Tag Manager works. You have a website running a GTM web container, and that web container has all these different tags for your different marketing and analytics needs. And those tags are communicating with their respective vendors. So you kind of have to trust that Google Analytics and Google Ads and these third-party analytics tools are not exploiting that data, or they're not taking anything else from the browser that you don't know what they're doing. And you have to load their JavaScript in the browser. You have to load their pretty bloated and heavy libraries to handle this work for you. With server-side tagging in your cloud, in your customer cloud, you now have the server container, which takes those streams instead. And you could even just have a single stream. So rather than having a Google Analytics stream, a Google Ads stream, and a third-party analytics stream, you can have a single focus stream that is then fanned out into all these different tags and different endpoints by the server container. And here we have this new terminology within the server container. So we have tags and we have triggers and we have variables, but we also have clients. And the client is basically something that takes those incoming requests, takes those streams in, and then parses them and fires tags with that information. So a client replaces the kind of trigger mechanism, event trigger mechanism that the web container have. Now a client takes those streams and decides which tag should fire. This is the most, in my opinion, this is the most confusing aspect of server-side tagging, is what a client is and what it does. And I hope that especially my walkthrough will help you understand that part. So it looks, sounds, and feels and smells exactly like GTM. The interface is exactly the same. The only change is the new clients feature in the menu. There's no zones either, as you can see. If you've been using 360, there's no zones here right now. Preview and debug mode is a bit different. Instead of opening in a little browser bar, it's now its own tab, but it works similar to before, so it's only available to your browser. So when you're sending hits, they will be appearing in the debug mode, but the entire hit stream from all your site visitors will not appear in preview mode. So preview lets you see things like, for these incoming requests, so those two collect rows in the preview mode, they represent HTTP requests to the server container. So they're basically the Google Analytics stream sending hits to your server container instead of directly to Google servers. And then the page view and timing complete represent what the client has done. So there's a universal analytics client there, which parses those HTTP requests and then generates this page view and timing complete event. And this page view and timing complete event will be those that you use to fire your tags with. So they're like the data layer event. And then when your tag fires in preview mode, you can see that firing status similar to web containers, but you'll also be able to see that the tag sent this outgoing HTTP request to Google Analytics servers. And this is all going to be part of the walkthrough as well, but just note that preview and debug mode will take a bit of getting used to. The terminology will be quite a bit different than what you're used to. So the great thing about server-side is that it gives you so many opportunities for improving data quality. So in this screenshot, for example, and this is something I'll show as well later, it's your typical Google Analytics hit, your everyday Google Analytics hit measurement protocol, but instead of sending it to Google Analytics, you're sending it to the server-side container. And the server-side container actually responds back. The regular measurement protocol hit doesn't have anything useful in the response from Google Analytics. But in the server container, I've configured the client to actually respond with a set cookie header. So the set cookie header writes the GA cookie instead of using JavaScript to write that cookie. And this is helpful for things like Safari's intelligent tracking prevention, because now that it's a set cookie header, it won't be subjected to the 7-day expiration that Safari's intelligent tracking prevention has on JavaScript cookies. So that's the introduction to server-side tagging. As I promised, it would be very brief. There's lots of, I'm going to go over some resources as well, but you'll find them on my blog as well. So there's the big article on server-side tagging, which should be a great intro. Jumping to key benefits and concerns. The biggest benefit, but also maybe the most controversial one, is that you own and control the data. And I have the screenshot from Google Cloud's privacy statement here. Now, you can be a Google skeptic as much as you like, and it's probably for good reason many times. I'll be the first to admit that they haven't been upfront about how data is being processed behind the scenes. But with Google Cloud, they do have this promise of you owning the data, and they have pretty robust contracts and SLAs to guarantee this. But even if you're still skeptical, you can just wait around for new deployment options to appear around, AWS if you trust Amazon more than Google, or on premises. The server-side container runs as a Dockerized container, so it's portable. You can basically set up any environment that supports Docker. There's just it's just not directly portable, so we have to wait for Google to release multi-cloud support. But if you don't believe in anything that Google says, for example, you can just wait around for other deployment options to come up. But yeah, that's how to approach this. So the reduced client load is a great benefit. So instead of a scenario on the left where you have like dozens and dozens of JavaScript libraries being downloaded and executed and processed by the browser, theoretically, you could move to a situation where you have just a single stream of events to the server container. In this example, we're using the measurement protocol of Google Analytics. You have just a single hit going to the server, and that single hit is then fanned out to Facebook and to Atlas Web and to Google Analytics and Hotjar and Chartbeat and so on. This is the ideal. It's very, very difficult to actually make happen because all these different vendors have so many idiosyncratic needs for those hits. But you could theoretically, or at least strive to reduce similar vendor tracking points to a single stream. So the fewer the streams you have, the fewer the client, the lesser, no, that's not a word, the smaller the client load will be. So you'll want to try to just reduce those streams to a minimum. The client in the server container, so the client thing, the client asset, will take that request and then fan it out and say that, okay, if this is a Facebook tag can fire and Google Analytics tag can fire and so on. Reducing this client load also helps with your content security policies. So CSPs are things where a website can indicate what scripts and what third-party domains, what domains can basically execute scripts or download images or do HTTP requests. So when you add new vendors to your site, you always need to update your CSP to support those vendors. But when you're moving to a server-side endpoint and you don't need to download those third-party scripts anymore, you can remove those domains from your CSP. Every single domain added to the CSP increases the risk of the CSP letting bad stuff through. So the smaller the content security policy, the more condensed it is, the better. So by reducing the client-side bloat, you're also reducing the inventory of third-party domains in your CSP and thus mitigating risks that come from hijacked domains, for example. And then because this is all happening behind the veil of the server, so nothing is visible to the browser that goes on in the server container, you can do things like process secret keys, API credentials, authentication tokens, things that you don't want to expose in the browser. You can expose them in the server container because that's only going to be visible to those who use the server container. So one example is here. We've had this big problem of measurement protocol spam in Google Analytics a couple of years ago. So one way we could combat it is by adding a secret key within the server container and then only as a custom dimension to all Google Analytics hits, and then only including hits that have that secret key. This would help in scenarios where the spammers are just randomly sending measurement protocol hits to different GA property IDs, which was the biggest reason for that spam. They basically just had a macro which went through random property IDs. It will also help if the spammer is using a crawler, so actually visiting sites and looking for those Google Analytics server hits, because now you're not actually sending anything to GA servers. The spammer would have to know to look for your server-side container URL in order to kind of copy that payload and then spam on. So this is all mitigating that kind of course, if somebody wants to spam you, they can. It's not difficult. All they have to do, if somebody wants to do targeted sabotage in your GA, it's still very easy to do. And this doesn't prevent that, but this would prevent that kind of large scale spam that was going on a couple of years ago. And you can also utilize HTTP responses. So one cool way that you can use server-side tagging today is you can actually proxy these third-party libraries through your server container. So instead of downloading them in the browser from third-party servers, you can download them in the server container itself and then return them back to the browser. So, and then you can also kind of do things like sub-resource integrity checks. So you can actually check whether that downloaded resources matches what you expect. If there's a mismatch, then it's either a version update or maybe a malicious party has done a hostile takeover of that library and is injecting their own code, and you can kind of mitigate against that already. So this is how the mage card attacks used to work, for example. So you can proxy those libraries and make sure that they are as expected and valid before returning them to the browser. And you can use the set cookie headers like I already showed. So you can make sure that those cookies aren't expired prematurely by things like Safari's tracking protections. So that example here shows how to treat the Google optimized cookie, which typically has a 3-month expiration, but on Safari browsers and iOS browsers, it only has a 7-day expiration. So by turning it into a set cookie header, you are kind of resuming its regular expiration. Then moving to the kind of concerns about server-side tagging is the biggest concern in my mind is that this gives you a chance to circumvent ad and content blockers. It's an ethical concern first and foremost. When a user is blocking analytics by virtue of browsing in a Firefox private window or using an ad blocker, they expect those hits to be blocked and they don't want to contribute to your data collection. Sure, they might be only wanting to block ads, and the analytics tools are kind of the baby thrown out with the bathwater, but that's not, in my opinion, that's not your call to make. If the user is using an ad blocker, then you have to kind of respect what it does and let it run its course. But by mapping your own custom domain, many of these ad blockers no longer work because they have a heuristic that looks for specific domains. There are two options here how to be more compliant with ad blockers. First is to create a little script that detects whether the user is using an ad blocker or not, and if they are, then kind of proactively block your own server-side tracking, which is a bit overkill, but it might be something you want to do in case you really want to allow the user to do what they want and avoid the potential brand damage that might happen if people notice that their data is still being collected even though they have these ad blockers. The second option is to wait for ad blockers to mature. So right now they're using these block lists where it's just domains listed that should be blocked. I think the future is more heuristic, has a more complex heuristic approach where they're actually looking at the payloads and trying to identify, is this payload a tracking payload or an advertising payload, and then remove or block those payloads from happening. So we'll see what happens in the future, but I know that many people see this as a benefit of server-side tagging. I'm not one of those people. I think this is a big concern in moving to server-side tagging. It makes it more difficult to let users do the blocking proactively and complying with that. The same thing applies to opaque data collection. So because this thing happens in the server, for example, if you have just that single hit stream, the user using the browser has no idea that that single hit stream is fanned out to Facebook and to Hotjar and to Adform and Google Analytics and so on. So the visibility to the browser is diminished. And this is a bad thing, especially if for auditors who are trying to see if a website is being compliant with consent. Because no longer can you see those vendor hits being actively blocked if you're not giving consent. You have to just trust that the server is doing its job correctly. And this is a big problem. And I don't think there's any other solution or any other resolution to this right now, except you have to just trust the site owner. And I know that's a big leap of faith to take, but they are legally responsible for what they're doing. This doesn't change that at all. It doesn't matter if it's in the browser or on the server. If there's a law preventing them from collecting data that's unconsented, they're still not allowed to do that. So you have to trust that they're obeying the law in that case. Which leads to another problem is that there's no built-in consent management yet. It would be great if there were a support for IAB's transparency and consent framework, for example. So being able to look at those consent strings automatically and determine based on that what cookies can be dropped or what requests can be sent. I'm pretty sure Google is working on something along these lines, because this is a pain point and will probably be a blocker for getting this out of beta. So having a robust consent management system. So right now you just have to build those consent management things yourself. You have to look at cookies by yourself in the server container, for example. And the cost can be prohibitive to many. Paying 1,200 euros a year for this tool might be a bit difficult for people who have used to GTM being free. I completely understand that, and if cost is a problem, then cost is a problem. For a production-ready environment, it's not easy to go below that 100 euros a month, and just sampling a lot of client-side data to avoid any peaks in your data collection is not a good idea either. So this is definitely geared to organizations that have the budget to run something like this. And then there's the problem that not all MarTech vendors and AdTech vendors have taken the jump to a server-to-server endpoint. Facebook does, Google Analytics does, Google Ads do, but there are still lots and lots of vendors who don't have a way or haven't documented a way how to send data to them using a server-side tagging engine. But I'm sure that this will change very soon now that Google is in the game. I'm sure that pretty much all the vendors, at least the bigger vendors, will be jumping at the opportunity to create those server-to-server endpoints. So those were the key benefits and concerns. We're pretty good on schedule. So I can now jump. I'm going to close this presentation because we don't need that anymore. And I'll just take a very, very quick look at chat if there's anything interesting for me there. Okay, so there's a couple of comments and questions. Just remember to post them in the Q&A. I probably won't tackle them in the chat itself, but we'll see how much time we have left. So I'll do a quick walkthrough of migrating a typical Google Analytics Atlas Web setup into server-side tagging. So here you have my blog and a situation which is very typical. So we have a Universal Analytics tag, and we have an Atlas Web tag, and we're collecting Universal Analytics to Google Analytics. So this is my hit that I just sent, and then we have the Atlas Web running in debug view as well, collecting data. So here you can see my page view as well on Atlas Web. And this is now a very regular setup. So my website is sending that data directly to Google as endpoints. There's no server-side tagging on the way. So let's start by moving Universal Analytics. So instead of sending the data to Google servers, it's proxy through the server container. So here we are now in the server-side tagging container. So we have the clients, we have the tags, and so on. The way it works is that first we need to create a client that specifically digests those Google Analytics requests and does something with them. So you always need a client. You can't have a server-side tagging environment without a client. And you can't send requests to your server-side tagging endpoint if there's not a client to claim that request. So we'll start creating a new client. There's some built-in clients here. So there's Atlas Web, Universal Analytics, and there's some custom clients that I've already built. So we have custom templates running in server-side tagging. So you can build your own templates as well if you're used to developing custom templates in Google Tag Manager. But we'll use the default one now. So we'll create a new Universal Analytics client. Priority determines the order in which clients are processed. So every single request can be claimed by a single client. So the higher the priority, the sooner the client gets to kind of make its claim. So if you have multiple different Universal Analytics clients all doing a different thing, you could set them to a different priority, and the one with the highest priority will be the one who has the first dibs on the request. It can say, I don't want to claim this request, at which point the request goes to the next client for processing, and so on. But because we just have this single client for the measurement protocol stream, we don't need to touch priority. Keep the default universal analytics paths checked. It just means that it's gonna, it expects like a regular measurement protocol hit to come in. Under more settings, let's just set this to JavaScript manage for now. I'll explain what that does in a bit. And then we'll just save it. And let's just name it UA for now. So now we have our first client. That's how you build a client. It's very simple. The purpose of this client is to look for measurement protocol request parameters in the incoming request, and then do something with that. And what it does is it runs a virtual container with the event from the measurement protocol request. And now I can create a tag that fires whenever that event happens and takes that data to Google Analytics. So what I need to do is I need to click to create a new tag. Again, there are custom tags up here, but then there's also these built-in tags. And now I want to build a Google Analytics Universal Analytics tag. So I select that. And now if you don't check enable overriding settings, it will automatically just use whatever parameters were in the incoming measurement protocol request. So whatever is sent by the web browser will be automatically transferred to this Universal Analytics tag. You can enable individual fields. For example, if you want to switch it from sending to your GA, you can update it here to send to a completely new GA property. Or you can update individual fields. Like let's say at this point, you'd want to add anonymize IP. You can do it like this, you know. So you can override the parameters in the incoming measurement protocol request with these options. But I don't want to do that. I just want to let it pass through. And then for the trigger, there's just a single trigger type, so which is the custom trigger. And currently triggers on all events. So this means that if a Facebook client runs a virtual container, if an Atlas web client runs a virtual container, this tag will fire every time. And assuming the event that the client created has all the necessary parameters, it will send that data to Google Analytics. But let's just be a bit more careful here. So there's a built-in variable named client name. If you don't see it, you have to choose it from the built-in variable menu. And then let's just make sure that this tag only fires when the Universal Analytics client has run this container. And let's just name it UA as well. Don't worry about my naming conventions. These are just for the webinar purposes. So now we have a tag and a trigger. Let's call this one just Universal Analytics. Now we have a tag and a trigger. So this tag fires whenever an incoming measurement protocol request to the server container has been parsed by the Universal Analytics client, and the client has created this container instance and fires this tag. So let's save that one as well. So now we have everything ready in our server-side environment. The next thing we have to do is make sure that the Universal Analytics tag actually sends that data to our server container instead of directly to Google Analytics. So we have to go to the web container running on the page. We'll open our Universal Analytics tag, and there's a new field under more settings, advanced configuration called transport URL. So this, by setting a URL here, you are effectively overriding the endpoint with which this tag communicates. So if I type here my server-side endpoint URL without the trailing slash, now instead of sending the hit to www.google-analytics.com, it's going to send it to sgtm.cmojave.com. So it's going to send the exact same payload, the measurement protocol payload, but instead of GA servers, it's going to send it to my own domain. So let's save that as well. And now we can take a look at preview mode in both our web container. So let's refresh preview mode. So now we've refreshed the web container, and then let's go to preview mode in the server-side environment. So as you can see, preview mode opens up in a new tab. And then we have the first column here, which will contain all the incoming requests. And now when I go to my site, let's remember that I have the real time here, which should show my hit in just a bit. When I go to my site and reload the page, now the Universal Analytics tag should be sending its data to my server container rather than directly to Google Analytics servers. So we can take a look at what the tag itself shows. It shows the transport URL as well. When we take a look at debug mode, we can now see, here's the incoming HTTP request. So this is the measurement protocol request sent by the web container to the server container. It shows me that a single tag has fired. We can look at details about the request as well. So by clicking the incoming HTTP request, this is what the browser sent. It shows me all the cookies that were sent with the request, shows me the refer, status codes, and so on. Then I select the page view event, so it automatically maps the page view hit type to this page view event. This is following the G tag schema. Now you can see that the UA client has claimed the request. So it means that the UA client recognized the request and said that I want to take this one. This is mine. And then you can see that there was an incoming HTTP request. By switching to the tags tab, you can see that the tag fired. And when you click that tag, you can then see there was an outgoing HTTP request. So the tag sent an HTTP request somewhere. And then when we open that, we can see that it sent the HTTP request to the Google Analytics server. So we have now essentially forwarded the Google Analytics request from our web browser first to our server container, and then from the server container to Google Analytics. And here in real time, you can see that it sent the page. It was 3 minutes ago, so that's why. Well, let's just, for the sake of the example, let's make sure that it works fine. So here you can see the page view appearing GA. So we're not doing anything crazy here. We're not rewriting anything in the request or anything like that. We're simply forwarding the request to Google Analytics. And now let's do the same for Atlas Web. So you can see that I have the Atlas Web tag here as well. So now let's create another client. And we'll create an Atlas Web client this time. Again, you don't have to touch anything else. We're happy with the default settings. So this Atlas Web client is primed to look for the Atlas Web payload, which is a bit different than the Universal Analytics payload. It's using something called Measurement Protocol version 2. So that's why these two clients will never conflict. They're trying to claim different requests. And then in tags, we can create the Atlas Web tag. Again, it will just leave the field blank to inherit whatever was in the original request. And then we'll create a trigger called AW, which only fires when client name equals AW. So this tag will only fire when the Atlas Web client actually claimed the request and did something with it. Great, so now we've kind of updated our server container. Sorry if I'm going a bit fast through all this stuff, but I want to get to the Q&A as quickly as possible. There's going to be like I said, the recording is going to be there, so you can always kind of watch it in slow-mo later on. We've updated the debug mode. Now we just need to update our Atlas Web tag. Atlas Web tags don't have the transport URL sending similar to Universal Analytics. They'll have it at some point, but they don't have it now. So instead, you have to manually add transport_URL, and then here put the sgtmcmohow.com. So now we've updated the web container as well to send the data to my server-side endpoint instead of to Google servers. Then let's reload the page. And now let's take a look at debug mode. Oh, something didn't. Oh, here we go. It was just a bit, of course, because it's batched. So now you can see two different requests. We have the measurement protocol request from Universal Analytics, which fires the Universal Analytics tag. And then we have the Atlas Web request, the measurement protocol v2 request, which fires the Atlas Web tag. And the Atlas Web tag, it doesn't show the outgoing HTTP request right now because it's Atlas Web works a bit differently. It basically batches all those events together and sends them once a certain time limit has been reached. So instead, you can see it when you select the request itself, you can see that there was an outgoing request, and this symbol means that it's a batched request. But you can see that it sent it to Google Analytics servers. And here in debug mode, you can see that there's now, well, let's actually reload this again. just to make sure that it works correctly. So now we wait for a while and we should see the page view event appear here in my Atlas Web Debug view. Just waiting for a while until it shows up. But you can, let's just make sure that it looks okay. Yes, there's the googleanalytics.com request. It was a success. For whatever reason, it's not showing up yet. Let's try once more. This is awkward. Well, it should appear there at some point. Let's just wait a while and let it run its course. While waiting for Atlas Web to react to what I'm doing. Hold on, I want to debug this. Well, while waiting for Atlas Web to kind of wake up, interesting. I'm just checking one more thing. Oh, here we go. I was looking under the wrong, okay, that was embarrassing. I was looking under the wrong debug device. But anyway, you can see here are my Atlas Web hits. You'll know it's me because there's the page location has my CMO demo UTM parameters. So anyway, okay, that's working. That was a weird tangent. Sorry about that. So one of the cool things that I mentioned is combining those streams. So let's imagine a situation where I don't want to have two different streams anymore. So I could, this is theoretically a step forward. I can basically just pause my Universal Analytics tag entirely. Let's pause it. So now Universal Analytics is no longer collecting data on my site. And instead, I can use the Atlas Web stream to send the event both to Atlas Web endpoint and to a Universal Analytics endpoint. So this is how you would combine those streams. So over here, we can also like, we don't need to delete the client, but we don't need the Universal Analytics client anymore. Under tags, all I have to do in this particular case is make the Universal Analytics tag fire on the Atlas Web event. And I know I can do this because those two streams are going to be very, very similar. They're using the same kind of unified event schema, and they share a lot of the same properties. There will be discrepancies with things like custom dimensions and so on, which you can then add into the map itself and override them here. And we'll also need to add a measurement ID here because the Atlas Web ID won't work. So let's put my own site here. So now I'm using the Universal Analytics tag, but it's running with the Atlas Web client. So I'm combining those two streams into one single stream that in the server container is then fanned out to these two different endpoints. So let's see how this works. Let's start by making sure that preview mode is up to date. And then let's just reload the page. So now you can see that only the Atlas Web tag fired. The Universal Analytics tag did not fire in the web container. And now in Atlas Web, we should soon see the page view event. We're not going to stick around waiting for it again because of something might be bugging again. I might have the wrong debug device inside. But in the in real time, you can now see that there's a new page view coming in for the Universal Analytics stream. Oh, here's the page view for Atlas Web. Similarly, we can, so the reason you're seeing two users is not a bug. It's simply because I have, in my test environment, I have a different cookie used in Universal Analytics and in Atlas Web. So that's why you see two active users. Now it uses the same client ID as Atlas Web does, but typically they would use the same cookie, so you would see them as a single user. So now I've consolidated those streams. Let's do something like, let's create an Atlas Web event. So let's do a scroll event. When I scroll down, it should automatically collect the scroll event to Atlas Web. So you can see that a scroll event was collected by the enhanced measurement of Atlas Web. And shortly it should appear here in Atlas Web, but also in Universal Analytics, it already appeared. So scroll event becomes event category general, event action scroll, and label would be the scroll depth. So now I'm just piggybacking off the Atlas Web stream and populating my Universal Analytics account with it. You can do it the other way around as well. So use the Universal Analytics stream and fan that out to Atlas Web. This is not a perfect example. Of course, there's lots of nuance that you want to add. You want to add Universal Analytics specific fields and Atlas Web specific fields. But this is the philosophy. This is how you would approach that data consolidation. And just before this walkthrough is over, I also want to show you the latest feature in server-side tagging, which was released at the same time, of course. And it's over here in clients. You have the option of moving to a server managed cookie. So server managed means that Google Analytics libraries like Atlas Web and Universal Analytics, instead of using the GA client ID written by JavaScript, they shift to a server-side HTTP cookie instead, which is called FPID by default, so first party identifier. And this basically is the client ID that will be used from now on. It will be an HTTP only cookie, so the client does not have visibility. The browser doesn't have visibility to it. It's more secure. It can't be used for cross-site tracking, for example, because typically third-party vendors would kind of leverage those first-party cookies and repurpose them for their own purpose, but they need JavaScript for that to work. But in this case, it's a server-managed cookie. There's also the option of migrating from a JavaScript managed client ID, which means that it will use the JavaScript cookie for as long as it exists to avoid a new user from being generated. But as soon as that JavaScript managed cookie is reset or deleted, it will start using the FPID instead. So it's Google kind of doing the client ID how it should have been done from day one, with an HTTP only secure cookie, which is not manipulated by JavaScript. But I'll just show you how it works. Let's save this and preview. So now I'm just going to quickly clear those two cookies. So clear the GA cookie. And let's see if I even had, oh, I have FPID, so let's clear that as well. And now let's reload the page. So now when we look at the Google Analytics request in our network tools, the browser responds with a set cookie header that has the FPID, and it has this weird hash that doesn't resemble a client ID at all. But what gets sent to Atlas Web and Google Analytics, Universal Analytics, is the old client ID. So this is the client ID you're used to. The 4987299924 is a regular client ID, and that will be used for as long as that cookie exists. But now if I go ahead and delete the GA cookie, so this is the same cookie, if I delete that, and now I send another hit, a new GA cookie is created, so 2030 something, but instead of using that, the requests will now use what was stored in the FPID. So this is how the server container has migrated to the server managed client ID. And this cookie will be then used from now on, so the FPID cookie. This, if you're using the migration path, it should have no impact on your data collection because the regular GA cookie is used for as long as it exists. And when it resets, the server container will start using FPID instead. So it would be a new user regardless, but this time the new user will be using a server-side cookie. So it's just an example of Universal Analytics also making improvements to things like cookie integrity and things like Safari's intelligent tracking prevention. So that's it for the walkthrough. Just as a recap, we walked through having a typical two tag or two vendor setup in our browser, and we switched those around to a server-side proxy, and we're now sending those that data to first to our server container, to the staging area, where we can do things like update its cookies or block them if the client is wrong, or update missing fields or similar things, and then sending that information onto Google servers. So that was the official part. So I'll just quickly take a look at the chat that we had. Do you think cookies set in the browser can be extended with server-side tracking? Is there any advantage for attribution? Yes. I think I mentioned this already, but with ITP in particular, moving to HTTP cookie will be a good idea because it extends the expiration. And Scott asked, should we be rushing to move all our clients to server-side tracking, or is client-side fine? I'd say that client-side is the way to go. And then in certain cases, moving to server-side because of the cost and because of the implications it has for content management. I would recommend just evaluating the options. There's a lot of information online about how server-side tagging is a new paradigm and what it actually does. So let's take a look at Q&A. Andrew Davies has the most upvoted question. For most cases, is a hybrid model preferred? Some dimensions and metrics from server-side, but enriched with client-side when where possible. Anything coming which might help combine and dedupe those? So that's a great question. So in almost all cases, I think a hybrid model is preferred. Like server-side tagging isn't server-side tracking. It's not by default. It doesn't survive without incoming HTTP requests. So it requires a source, a network source, and that network source could be a web browser or a client device or a point of sale system or an Excel worksheet that's connected to the internet or something similar. So you need that incoming HTTP request stream. But once you have that, then you can do a lot of interesting things with the server container, like combining those streams into a single stream, or removing PII, checking for consent, making sure only validated data is passed through, and so on. For combining and especially deduping those data sets, that depends on the vendor itself. So for example, Facebook has the event ID. So if you're sending events directly from the browser to Facebook and from the browser to the conversions API, using the server-side container, you can send an event ID with 2 identical requests, and Facebook will deduplicate them based on that. Google Analytics doesn't have anything like that at the moment. It's something you can build yourself with a hit scope custom dimension. So sending like a hit ID and then deduping them in BigQuery or whatever data store you're using. Which reminds me that some of the really cool things that are coming up, or we can imagine are coming up, are things like native cloud integration. So being able to interact with BigQuery or PubSub or Google Cloud Storage or Cloud Functions directly from the server container without having to worry about authentication or OAuth processes is like a really, really cool use case. And I hope to see them in the near future. Ashish asks, I haven't used Segment, but does Segment and server-side tagging in GTM be used to achieve similar things? I believe so. I believe they can be used to achieve similar things. I think Segment is a bit broader in scope, allowing you to run, for example, GTM as well through it. But there's also specific differences where Google Tag Manager is running in your own cloud instance, and I think it's more portable than Segment. Cost-wise, I don't know. I'm not a Segment user. So like I said, this isn't reinventing the wheel. There are many solutions out there that do what GTM does. There are people who have built their own things that do what GTM does in the server side, and that's fine. I don't think Google has been claiming that this is something that everybody needs to switch to. If you want to use Segment, go ahead and use Segment. I think this does have some unique aspects that make it interesting, especially for people who are newcomers to Google Cloud. It's a great entry product into Google Cloud. You don't have to worry about the cloud, but just that it's in the background will let you introduce yourself to some of its concepts. So other people can shout out in chat if they have more experience with Segment, but that's how I see it. Nick asks, to what extent was the introduction of server-side tagging motivated by ITP moves by browsers? Being asked to trust commercial organizations to self-policy is not something that I see as realistic. That's a great point. I think I mentioned that as well. So there is a trust of self-policing here. And I totally understand that people don't kind of jump at the opportunity to have to trust more. I do believe that I don't think server-side tagging itself was motivated by ITP. I think it's just an server-side tagging has the benefit of manipulating those HTTP requests. ITP isn't, so just to clarify, ITP itself isn't necessarily a data privacy move. It's not something that's required by any law or legal framework to have your cookies set to 7-day expiration. It's how Safari combats cross-site tracking. Everything that ITP does has to do with cross-site tracking, and cross-site tracking specifically means vendors who have a common data store for a user who visits different unrelated websites. So if you're not doing cross-site tracking, if you're using your server-side endpoint to rewrite those cookies, there's nothing controversial about that. That's how you should be writing cookies. JavaScript interface for cookies has always been a bad idea. Being able to read cookies in the browser, it's always been a bad idea. So by moving to this server-side endpoint and using HTTP only cookies, for example, you're using cookies as they were meant to be used in a very secure way. So that's not necessarily part of the self-policing. I think the self-policing comes with not knowing what kind of data controlling is, what kind of controller stuff is happening behind the scenes, what kind of cookie syncing, data matching, stuff like that. But this has been possible before GTM. It's anybody can build those reverse proxies as much as they like. Vendors are getting organizations to build CNAME aliases just to be able to kind of leech their first party data. So ITP is mitigated by moving to a server-side environment. If Safari notices that, for example, server-side Google Tag Manager is being used for cross-site tracking, then ITP will adapt and it will add additional protections to prevent that from happening, maybe reducing all first-party cookies to a certain expiration, and we'll just have to accept that. I'm not exactly proud of our industry and how they're trying to figure out new ways to collect that data without user consent and new ways to figure out cross-site tracking. So I believe that many of the reactions from the browser space are justified, even though they might seem totally overkill to our cases. But that's a great question from Nick. Ollie says, I believe Facebook is pushing clients to switch their conversions API. In order for this to work, they need PII data to match against the FB account ID. Will you be able to push PII data from a server GTM directly to Facebook? Of course you will. There's nothing in the technology that prevents you from collecting whatever you want. You can collect credit card information, passwords, whatever you want. It's a blank slate. It's a technological tool. Facebook has the advanced matching option, which lets you match against hashed email addresses and first names and last names. Of course, you need consent to do that. So you as the organization collecting that data to Facebook will of course need consent for that, or at least in the European Union, you're going to be breaking the law. But Facebook also uses the FB CLID. So if the user landed from a click from a Facebook link, the Facebook click ID will be present as a URL parameter in those server-side container hits as well, assuming that's how you build the Facebook tag, or the cookie will be saved as the FBC cookie. So you don't necessarily need that PII, you just need at least the Facebook click ID in those, which is a shady practice as well, but that just means that you can also use these pseudo anonymous identifiers, although everybody knows that Facebook click ID is bound to the identity in the Facebook platform itself. Ame asks, can we extend existing clients, for example, creating a client, inheriting, and add more features to it? So at the moment, you can if it's a custom template, a custom client built by the community. You can't extend built-in clients like Universal Analytics and Atlas Web. But for example, I've built my own Universal Analytics client, which was very simple to do because the measurement protocol request is what makes the whole thing go around. So as long as the incoming request is fine, the forwarding is fine as well. So if you want to respect do not track header, you would build your own Universal Analytics client, which specifically looks for that header, and you would then add it. You can also create a trigger condition which looks for a specific header, I think. Let me just quickly take a look if that's possible. I think it's possible that you can take individual request headers as a variable. Yes, so you can create a variable called a request header. So you can switch that variable to the do not track header, and then in your tags triggers, You can check, does the do not track header exist? And if it does, then block the tag. So you don't even need a client. The variables you can create include things like request headers and query parameters and cookie values from the incoming request. So that's actually pretty cool. That's a good use case. That's a very good use case you had. So you could create that as a blocking trigger. Matt asks, have you tried to automate the QA of the server-side tags now that not visible from the browser? What options do you see here? Extensions, schema validators, APIs, etc. I've done some simple QAing, just for the purposes of examples. Of course, there's a lot of things you can do. The simple examples I've been doing are things like event value. If a Google Analytics event has the event value in the wrong format, Google Analytics will not process that hit. So I have a simple check that looks in the client. Does this request have an event value? And if it does, is it a number? If it's not a number, then turn it into a number, because that's the only way it will pass to Google Analytics. You could do it with e-commerce events. If the e-commerce event has a transaction revenue but doesn't have the transaction ID, you kind of discard that hit before it's even sent to GAs, just so that you don't collect bogus hits. You can look for PII. Just look for the email address string in the entire request. If it has that, either clear it or then block the request from happening. You can do all this stuff in the client. You can do all this stuff in triggers to block tags, for example. Then extensions, schema validators, API. You have the full HTTP request universe at your disposal. There's APIs that allow you to send HTTP requests and fetch them back. So you could, if there's a spam detection API, for example, you could send details about the hits to that API in the server container, wait for the response, analyze the response. If the response says that, hey, this is spam, then block it. You could install reCAPTCHA v3 endpoint into your server container and run Google's reCAPTCHA service to identify spam traffic as well. Whether or not this is automated depends. You have to build that stuff yourself, but once it's there, you can automate it. So that's all pretty cool. Will you share this presentation document as well to us? I think I will. I hadn't made a specific decision about it because I didn't think the presentation itself was that useful as the walkthrough. But yeah, I'll make sure to share that in the video link. Could you please share the recording? Yes, as I mentioned, the recording will be in those emails. The recording will be on my YouTube channel, and I'll share those YouTube channel links in Twitter and LinkedIn as soon as I have the videos up there. It's going to take a couple of days, simply because I'm going to be quite exhausted at the end of this day. The bloat process will still be running at visitor browser end. Will it affect load speeds? So I'm not sure what this question means. I mean, if the bloat process can be so you don't need to load any third-party JavaScript. You don't even need WebGTM to run a server-side setup. You can build your own super small analytics JavaScript tag that runs in the page template and sends that event stream to server-side container. And at that point, you have very little bloat. There's no resource loads. It's just inline JavaScript being run. Or you can still use vendor JavaScript like Universal Analytics JS and just use the transport URL option. You have lots of different possibilities here. You don't have to use WebGTM. You don't have to use Universal Analytics libraries. You can slim down those requests as much as you want and then use the power of the client in the server-side tagging environment to kind of map those hits correctly. Quickly jumping into chat because I see there's a related question. Do you believe server-side tagging will have a significant improvement to website load speed substantially for those with many tags? Well, ideally it will. Ideally it will improve that because you can get rid of those third-party libraries by not having to download the Facebook library, for example, because you've built your own little web tag that communicates with the Facebook client, or by not having to download the analytics.js library anymore because you're using some other method to send the data. That's all going to reduce from the client load. But obviously you can also go the other way. You can build your really complex, really super large third-party vendor setups if you want. But in my opinion, this does give you lots and lots of tools to reduce that client load and improve those page load speeds as well. It just requires work. It's not an automated process. Like I said in the very beginning, this is a blank slate and you're free to kind of use it however you want. Any plans to bring the web container and server container configured together so don't have to manage separately? Well, this question should be directed at Google, of course, but I doubt that that's ever going to be a possibility. They are two completely separate worlds. with a completely different set of template APIs that are available. I think hopefully there will be options to kind of keep two in sync. So have a single, for example, if there's a specific web tag that's needed for a client to work, there would be an option in the gallery, for example, to download all the necessary templates to the related containers. But I'm kind of skeptical if there's ever going to be a single container view for both web and server, because they are not related in any way. Like I said, you don't need a web container to work with the server container. The server container is its own isolated thing. Yes, Dave, a very good question. This is my fault, and this is also Google's fault. So when I say client, I can mean two different things. A client is also the opposite of the server. So a client is what's sending data to the server endpoint. It can be a web browser, a mobile device, a point of sale system, a curl command run from the command line. And then a client is also what's running in the server container. This kind of bothers me so much. So when I say client, I can mean one of two things, and I'm really sorry about this confusion. I should have maybe always mentioned the context when I say the word client. So hopefully it hasn't been too ambiguous throughout this presentation. Ronald says, notice your FB client template isn't available to us. Is it one of yours or one Google, Facebook will officially release, since the template gallery seems to also be off at the moment? Yes, so template gallery hasn't been released yet for server side. I think they're just waiting for more templates to appear before they're doing the publishing it. The Facebook thing is my own creation. I'm not ready to publish it yet. Also because I don't know what Facebook is going to be doing officially. Maybe they want to release their own templates. So I'm holding it off for now. I just want to say that it works. So a full Facebook server to server stream is completely doable. And you can run a simple tag in WebGTM that doesn't download anything from Facebook servers. So the browser itself or the device will not communicate with Facebook directly at all. Everything happens through the server container, and you have all sorts of mechanisms in place for making sure that only valid hits are being sent and no third-party cookies are being leached. So it's completely doable. The convergence API that Facebook uses is pretty impressive technically. Ame says, feel free to correct me, but I think remarketing platforms features synced client with the redirected user JavaScript call across the network sites. This won't be possible anymore. Yes, so retargeting that requires third-party cookies and redirect and bounce trackers obviously will not work as they currently do if you move to server side. So this is something that those remarketing platforms will have to figure out if they want to support a server side proxy, because third-party cookies will no longer be working. So there's another, can you share recording? I'll just skip that because I've already answered that. So Nick asks, if the request is sent by the server, are the user agent and IP address copied so that GA reports device and location info correctly? The built-in clients, Universal Analytics and Atlas Web, do this. So they take the incoming headers, the IP remote address, the user's IP, and they take the user agent header as well, and they copy it to the outgoing request using the dedicated fields in measurement protocol. And this is, by the way, a really great way to actually anonymize your data. So if you know the anonymize IP option in analytics only removes the last octet, and it still sends the IP into Google server logs. So with a server-side tagging setup, this is a great example of improved privacy and security, because you can actually not have the client override that user agent and IP and have every single measurement protocol request leaving the server container mapped to the App Engine machine. So that's a great way to hide the user, because their IP and user agent are no longer available. So they do it by default. So they copy the user agent and IP by default, but you can set those fields as blank in the client to prevent the overriding from happening. And if you build your own client, it's very simple to copy them as well. But this is, again, a great way to obfuscate the actual browser user and do anonymize IP correctly. Angela asks in the chat, how does a server managed cookie impact cross-domain tracking? Currently, it doesn't work, but there's a solution on the way for cross-domain tracking, which basically has a temporary JavaScript cookie set just for the purpose of cross-domain tracking. But that's a good question, because HTTP-only cookies would definitely not work with cross-domain tracking, because they require the cookie to be part of the link itself. So there's a solution for that coming up. Anonymous attendee, if the request payload is originating from the browser, how reliable data would that be? Wouldn't the browser elements like ad blockers hamper the data? So I'm not sure what this means. I think I mentioned this, that if you have your own dedicated domain, then ad blockers most likely won't touch that data because your domain is unlikely to be on the block lists if those browsers use block lists. And ITP similarly doesn't do anything for that request unless the domain has been flagged as a tracking domain. And even then it only basically applies to things like HTTP request and HTTP header. So it depends on what you mean by hampering the data. But I would say that there's much less hampering going on than if the browser is directly communicating with the vendors and downloading their JavaScript. George asks, in terms of actual cases, we leave the GTM tag inside the pages, but we edit the tag with transport URL. That's all for the GTM, not for the analytics script client side. So that's all you need for the collect request to move to your server container rather than Google Analytics. The browser will still communicate with Google Analytics servers to download the analytics.js library, but there's a way to proxy that as well. And that's probably going to come into those built-in clients soon. But currently there's no way in web tags to prevent the downloading of analytics.js from Google servers. So that's something we're still waiting to be able to completely proxy analytics.js from the servers. But when you use transport URL, Google Analytics tags will no longer communicate with Google Analytics servers. They will communicate with your server-side endpoint. So I think Varsha's question comes in two parts. Will server-side tagging help in overcoming the rate of hits we are getting for short-term campaigns? Some contents in our site are changing over a period of months, like banners, marketing sales. I'm not sure what that means. I don't think it's relevant to server-side tagging. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what that question means. Server-side tagging isn't a campaign tracking tool, or it doesn't kind of change how your business is setting up those campaigns and how those hits are coming in. So if you want, you can clarify the question a little bit. Is having a server-side, Dell asks, is having server-side tagging improve the Lighthouse performance scoring, especially performance? I think I've mentioned performance quite a few times now. So by reducing the number of third-party libraries, you are improving your page speed. You can add custom cache headers to all the requests that are coming in through server-side containers, so you can improve that as well. So ideally, it will improve those scores, but who knows? There's so many aspects to page speed that's other than just outgoing requests and library downloads. It's also about things like CSS and how the layouts have been configured and so on. Ame has a general question for implementing tracking in its current form. Google Analytics is limited for developers who want to support products relying on real-time, near real-time events. What would be your general recommendation to achieve this? I see server-side container working well, as developers can now push those events to Kafka or PubSub with the same call. Do you have other better pattern or idea you have implemented? Well, I mean, if you want real-time, Universal Analytics is not your tool. It's not a real-time analytics tool. It has a very uninteresting real-time tracking capability. Atlas Web is a bit better, but even that is not perfect. If you want full real time, you'll need to use another tool that's dedicated to that. You could install Snowplow, for example, which lets you configure that real time pipeline however you want. You could do a PubSub to a BigQuery stream, or in Amazon you can use Kinesis Firehose or whatever floats your bottle. So so real time is depends very much on the platform you're using. At some point, I do believe that server side could be used to just siphon that information directly to BigQuery. So you could create your own analytics endpoint out of the server side tagging tool as well. Is it possible to track redirections and outbound links of site using server side tagging like transport URL? Server-side tagging doesn't track anything in the client. So an outbound click is something that the client does, the browser does. The user clicks a link and then sends an event somewhere for that outbound link click. Server-side tagging collects that request. So server-side tagging can be used to track those outbound link clicks, assuming you're sending that information to the server-side tagging endpoint. It's not an analytics tool in itself. It's an endpoint to which you send hits configured by an analytics tool. I understand that this is a point of confusion because it's it's using the words, tag manager. But in this case, it's literally just tag endpoints rather than tags that do things like click tracking or something similar. When will Google officially add server-side tags for Floodlight Google Ads? I have no idea. I don't work at Google and I don't have visibility to their roadmap. And the visibility that I do have is controlled by very strict NDAs. So I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. Before the beta is over, if I'd had to guess. In your video, you showcased the analytics script proxy. Following this implementation, what the web tag will look like in order to not load the script in the client. Yes, so like I already mentioned, there's no way to currently prevent the analytics.js from loading the Google Analytics server, the Universal Analytics Library. So you can proxy analytics.js, just create a custom HTML tag that loads the script from your server-side endpoint, but you can't prevent GA from loading the analytics library from Google servers. I'm pretty sure that feature will be coming at some point, hopefully soon, because otherwise the whole idea of the Google script API will be kind of redundant. Arturo, for a hybrid mode where we want to send just some information to clients but keep most of the tagging, do we need to create 2 containers or just one should be enough? Well, I mean, you'll whatever you want to send directly from the browser to the vendors, you'll still need a regular web container. And then if you want to collect data into your server-side endpoint, you'll need a server-side container. So at the bare minimum, you need those 2. If you want to switch to full server-side, you don't need the web container anymore, but you'll need to replace that tracking logic, some JavaScript running on the side, sending those hits to the web container. Andy, so like you showed, using server container and web container, the data now flows through the client. You also mentioned about the possibility to not load the JS file at all by sending only the headers. So there's a possibility to avoid all JS file loads. What you also mentioned about, I'm not sure what you're referring to. You don't need to load a JavaScript file. No, you're just sending HTTP requests, so GET and POST requests to an API endpoint. You don't have to load any JavaScript if you don't want to. You can run inline as well. JavaScript running in the page template. You still need something that builds those hits to the server, and that's typically JavaScript. You could have image tags like HTML tags if you're only collecting image pixel hits. But typically you would have JavaScript. But whether the JavaScript is loaded from a third-party vendor or from your own servers is also a big difference. So it really depends on how you build. Like I mentioned a couple of times, server-side tagging is just an endpoint. It doesn't run the tracking logic for you. You still need something to create that tracking logic. Or if you're only interested in like server-to-server tracking, you still need something in your other server environments to send those hits to the server endpoint. Julio, maybe I pronounced that correctly. Hey Simo, long-time reader, first-time questioner. Will preview sharing debug mode work the same way with server-side implementation? Also, will there be any way to self-host multiple parallel servers to mitigate risk of downtime? I'm not sure about how preview sharing will work. Currently, it doesn't. I have no idea. This is, again, something that Google will then release in good time. I would assume there would be a sharing opportunity because it's working with cookies as well. Will there be any way to self-host multiple parallel servers to mitigate risk of downtime? Well, I mean, you can already increase the number of App Engine instances. So within the Google Cloud Platform, that's all you need. You just need to add a maximum number of instances, for example, 6, and then have auto-scaling on. Obviously, if Google Cloud itself combusts or breaks down, then you're going to lose that data. But you can create load balancers with Google Cloud as well that send some of the data to your App Engine and maybe some to a Kubernetes cluster or Cloud Run or whatever. So Google Cloud has a lot of network egress options for load balancing and for making sure that there won't be any downtime. You just have to kind of tweak those scaling systems. So I on my clients that I'm running this on, I use 3 instances with a maximum of 6 and auto scaling set to 1. And it would take an enormous amount of traffic for that setup to be at risk of falling apart because there's too much traffic. Jason asks, would it be possible to set an endpoint as a form submission destination? Yes, you can have a form send, post, and get requests to your server-side container, and then your server-side container can have a client which parses those form responses and then does something with them, maybe sends them to your CRM or something. So yes, you can absolutely build a form collection endpoint in your server-side tagging endpoint. any HTTP request flow can be redirected to the server container, and there's lots of APIs that let you process those requests, send them forward, or call other APIs or whatever. So you have the full power of the HTTP protocol at your for you. Yeah, only using server container is a possibility. It absolutely is. So that's all the questions now. Thank you so much. There was a lot of questions here. We hit the 90 minutes almost to the minute, so I'm very impressed by that. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was useful. I'm sure that I went over some things really fast, but you can then look at the recording afterwards. And there's going to be recordings for the 2 other webinars as well that follow for the other time zones. So maybe there's some things that you might have missed that are going to be in those webinars. As I promised, I'm going to remove you from the email list and make sure that I don't spam you at all anymore. If you want more information about server-side tagging, I'll be sure to add some show notes to the YouTube video, and I'll be sure to share the presentation, and then just follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn and whatever, because that's where I'll be sharing all the new content as well. So if there's nothing else, thank you so much for taking the time for this. I know it's been a long 90 minutes and a lot of information in a short amount of time. But I hope that I've inspired you to take a closer look at server-side tagging and maybe abandon some of your prejudices to server-side tagging, and just give it a shot. The automatically provisioned server is practically free. So if you're interested in the technology, just install it, play around with it a little, and then decide if this is something you actually want to invest time and money in. Have a great day, everyone.